Welcome back to our Economics of Regulation course. Today we are going to discuss in Chapter 5 why we should regulate natural monopolies, how we do that, and I would like to give you an overview of the history and institutions of regulation. But before I get to that, there are still a few open points in the chapter Contestable Markets and the War of Attrition. So what I want to do is very briefly wrap up what we did last week here and do the remaining parts. First of all, I try to jump to the next slide, which somehow summarize all or the most important points of contestable markets. Here the starting point is a downward sloping average cost curve, AC, which shows us that we have sub-additivity and therefore what we call a natural monopoly in our technological sense. What we see here, and that's the important point about contestable markets, we assume that the threat of entry is very important, that there are hyper-free accident entry is possible, and the point therefore is that we obtain a result in which price is equal to average cost. Why do we get that? Now, the point here is we have two conditions. The first one being feasibility. That is, our incumbent, our firm which is active, must be able to break even. That means that the price cannot be below average cost. On the other hand, we have a second condition. The price can also not be above average cost because we have sustainability, meaning simply that a potential entrant could not enter, could not run into this market, capture all the demand by a price below the incumbent and make some profits. And at any price above average cost, this kind of profitable hit and run entry would be possible. So here, this is somehow what summarizes our equilibrium configuration in contestable markets, and that's what we already did, I think, in a tutorial class on Tuesday. So I discussed that at some length last time. I even produced a new slide on that, which shows you more directly that this is really a rather peculiar example, but I want to go through the details here right now. What I think pretty much ended with last week was this slide where I told you that contestable markets mean, if we have a multi-product world, that we take advantage of cost sub-additivity, that is only a single firm produces, so no waste in a technological sense. And the point is we also get a very nice result from the viewpoint of welfare, because this firm doesn't have market power in the sense that it makes profit. Of course, we don't get first best because otherwise, as average costs are above marginal cost, we would have losses. But we get a second best result with price equal average cost. And the important point here, we are talking about the multi-product world. Here the important point is that there is no cross-subsidization. Each product will have to be sold at least at its incremental or average incremental cost. Otherwise, that means that's what we will discuss at some length next. Otherwise, that means that if some product sells below its average incremental cost, other products have to sell above their standalone cost. And of course, if someone sells above standalone cost, or if some parts of the products are sold at above standalone cost, another firm could jump in, produce just this set of products and break even. Okay, and typically, on average, the price of each product exceeds its marginal cost. We have to somehow cover the common cost, and under certain conditions, we will get back to that later, what Ramsey-Bourdieu prices is, but under some conditions, we obtain Ramsey-Bourdieu prices. Here now a very brief technical definition of cross-subsidization. We will get back to that at the middle of this lecture, perhaps. And here's a definition of under what circumstance we might consider or we consider a price configuration not involving cross subsidies. That is, it is subsidy free. And the condition here is that all consumers pay at least the incremental cost of providing them with the service. If there's one consumer, it's just the incremental cost. If there are many, it's the average incremental cost. So they have to produce what really can allocate it to these specific products. And on the other hand, no one pays more than the standalone cost. So each consumer living somewhere in a Vogelsberg on a remote farm, if she wants to get connected to the electricity network, she has to pay the incremental cost from providing her, from digging a line from her farm to the next transmission node. Okay, that's what we have. We will have a nice example in the tutorial class, so that this should be really clear. What is the advantage of such a configuration? The point is, and that's the most important point, such a subsidy-free price configuration is sustainable if we allow for entry. Otherwise, if we have cross-subsidization, for instance, that people in rural areas get prices for the telecom services which are below cost because costs are very high and they pay the same prices as people in urban areas, we might get cream skimming, that is, in some parts of the market people enter. The most important discussion here is perhaps in terms of the coaches of the far distance buses. If we have a connection, if Deutsche Bahn charges everywhere an average price for all connections, irrespective of whether it's a high profitable line like Cologne-Frankfurt or it's a more remote, like, I don't know, I don't want to insult anyone, but you can imagine there are some connections which are not heavily used and where costs are hardly covered. If you allow for entry, then of course, like Flixbus will enter the connections which are highly profitable and try to skim the cream. And we will get back to that later. A similar point is inefficient bypass. Here, inefficient bypass means that a company builds up its own infrastructure. That's what you saw in the business areas in many cities at a time when telecom prices were still high. So international companies just dig their own or lay their own cables and provided their own telecom services. This is all the result of cross-subsidization. And finally, this is the point mentioned up here. High-price consumers who typically also would benefit from cross-subsidization, of course, they then cannot get, if the configuration is subsidy-free, they cannot get the subsidies, but they still, excuse me, they still benefit from being part of that market because they don't have to cover the whole common cost. Hopefully that's clear. We will discuss that at more length in the tutorial class by means of a single example. Actually, I don't know where it's, I think it's assignment 3, yes. Okay, hopefully this is clear. The point is, and I think I didn't give you that, is this important, this model of contestable markets? And what we saw is we only have fixed costs, no sunk costs. And Josco is rather pessimistic in terms of the real world importance. He says here that it seems that the primary point that emerges from this lengthy discussion or lengthy literature on contestable market is that one cannot conclude that there are necessarily monopoly problems from the observation that there is only a single firm active. Okay, that's an important point. You observe that you have a monopoly, but the monopoly is not a problem because potential entry forces this monopoly to charge a price which is competitive in a sense that price is equal to average cost, even though there is increasing returns and there is what we call a natural monopoly. Okay, the point is here, even if we get a market structure in the end where we have a single firm being active, so a monopoly naturally emerges, as Josco puts it, we have no or small welfare or social costs here. Okay, so no problem. But what his main point is that this is more like a theoretical possibility. The point is here, however, this theoretical possibility builds very much on the fact that we don't have sunk costs, okay? We only have fixed costs. But the problem is, this is not really a very convincing story, as Georg tells in his books, because fixed costs are no fixed costs if not sunk to some extent. Otherwise, fixed cost would be negligible. The story here goes as follows. Suppose you have to have production over 2 periods. In each period, you have production cost of fixed cost plus some marginal cost times the output. Then the point is, if you produce that for 2 periods and you have an output and you have a storable product, okay? You could produce all product at once in period 1. Then the point is, you would just produce, neglecting for the moment some issues like discounting and inventory cost and so on, which marginally would change our thinking, but not in principle. So the point is just, rather than producing 2 periods and paying the fixed cost twice, you would just produce everything in the first period and you save on fixed cost. And Tirol does these lead or put that to the extreme, saying, okay, just divide this period 1 into 2 sub-periods, so you save then another half of these fixed costs. And then you divide it further and you save another half. And in the end, you pay the fixed cost for, say, 10 seconds. And then you produce in this 10 seconds millions of output units. And you actually have hardly no fixed cost to pay. Okay, and that's exactly what I gave you here. Making period length smaller and increasing production in that period decreases fixed cost compared to variable cost. But you saw this sounds really strange, and it is, because typically either market imperfections, you cannot rent your capital just for 10 seconds typically, and you also typically have some specific upfront investment. So you always will have some part of the fixed cost will be sunk. Therefore, he defines fixed cost slightly different. Entering this sunk here, fixed costs are costs that are independent of the scale of production and are locked in, that is, are sunk for some short length of time, and this short length of time defines our period. So that's 1 period is just a period for which is fixed cost. So, and that of course means now we do not have this idea of firm can just enter because it doesn't actually have really sunk cost. It just could move away. Now it has sunk cost for some period of time. And then that's what you also will see in the assignment. Actually, that's good that we didn't do. I think can you show that what we didn't do, if I find it, is what we didn't do already assignment. I have to show it as well here. What we didn't do this problem 3 here, 4 here, which is actually where we discuss this issue. Okay, here we will see, and actually the point here is that what you will show is that or under what circumstances contestability re-emerges, and it actually re-emerges if fixed costs are sunk, but they are sunk for a shorter period of time than it takes to adjust prices. Because then the incumbent, knowing that she cannot react to the entrant, it has to, by lowering its prices. For instance, if we have Lufthansa, and Lufthansa knows now they charge a very high price on in the times without Corona, it charges a very high price on the connection between Cologne and Berlin. And it just knows that if there is an entrant, call this entrant Germania, if it enters with a lower price Germania, Lufthansa could just also decrease its price, and therefore Germania couldn't make any profit. Okay, but the point is, if it could not react with its prices, the world is quite different. Okay, because it would have to leave its prices high, and Germania would pretty much So suppose it is not allowed for some reasons to change the price within the next year, then Germania would take all the market. Okay, and that would mean actually that Lufthansa, knowing that if it is not allowed to reduce the price, it would have to set a low price which is equal average cost from the very beginning. Okay, even though there might be some fixed cost capacity commitments and so more. The important point is that capacity can be adjusted more quickly than prices can be set. What does it mean? Germania can put its aircraft faster to Cologne airport than Lufthansa can change its prices. Okay, I will give you a better example because that sounds strange and of course is practically wrong, because we had this case, look it up somewhere, Lufthansa and Germania, there was a decision of the Federal Cartel Office, the Bundeskartellamt. But the point is that in this case, if prices are sunk for a longer time, or prices, to adjust prices takes longer than to adjust capacity, then contestable markets re-emerge, and it's the generalization then of petrol competition, and we still get what is called hit and run entry. Okay, so I gave you a story and I told you afterwards that the story is wrong and doesn't fit with the empirical facts, and this is pretty much what Josko said here. Josko saying that especially for the industries with natural monopoly characteristics, prices adjust much more quickly than can production capacity and its associated sunk cost. According to this approach to contestable market equilibrium, does not appear to be of much practical interest either. The either is from what we had up there. In the very beginning, he said nice theoretical possibility, these contestable markets, but not very relevant. And here this price adjustment, okay, also nice theoretical idea, but not interesting either. But is this true? Actually, the point is how quickly can Deutsche Telekom, for instance, change its prices? Actually, it has, or some other regulated incumbent, it has typically to go through lengthy procedures in order to change prices. And in particular, at the beginning of liberalization, I think France Telecom from the very beginning reduced its price because they were afraid of entry, whereas Deutsche Telekom did not do that, perhaps not realizing that they would have a hard time to change their prices. We had a lot of entry, in particular by call-by-call, so-called call-by-call providers and by pre-selection providers, and they just undercut Deutsche Telekom, and within a month or two, they got 50% of the market share, and they had very low entry cost. Another example I will give you not tomorrow, next Tuesday in a tutorial class with respect to this question I just discussed with you. With the entry, I once was active as an economic expert in a case that was about gas or Gasfernleitungsnetze, so gas pipeline networks, for distance or national gas pipeline networks. And here the idea is, of course, you cannot, if there is one, if Stadtwerke Hamburg, if the municipal electricity and gas company of Hamburg is connected to some pipeline network, and of course an entrant cannot just come and set up a second pipeline network. But in Germany we have two pipeline networks, and one of the entrant was Wintershall, a company which is somehow subsidiary of BASF and I think even of Gazprom. And of course, they don't have a connection to Hamburg, but they have a connection to, say, 20 or 50 kilometers, or the pipeline network passes Hamburg at a distance of 20 to 50 kilometers. Now, what you could do now is just to have a bypass, a Stichleitung, from this pipeline to Hamburg. Okay? Of course, this would cause additional cost here, but would that be possible? To do that, now the point is, it is possible if they are allowed to charge or to have long-run contracts. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, they just make then a contract with Stadtwerke Hamburg for 30 years. Then, and this will be part of our example, then they can just provide this service, and knowing of this potential competition, the current provider of Stadtwerke Hamburg will face this potential competition, even though these pipeline networks are really sunk cost. Okay, hopefully you got this somehow. I might get back to that on Tuesday. There's another point I don't want to discuss that. That's another theoretically possibility, short-term capacity commitments, but time is short today anyway. It's a very nice theoretical thing, but I didn't come up with a nice story, so I skip it here and get back to or move on to the war of attrition, which has a very similar kind of flavor, but here it's now different because here two firms actually enter. War of attrition would be Zermürbungskrieg or Abnützungskampf or ruinous competition in German, ruinöse Konkurrenz, ruinous competition in German. The idea is here you have now really, if you want to enter the market, you have to pay the fixed cost, okay? And you have two firms both enter the market. Call them, say, Sky and the Zone. They both enter the market. They are currently not really identical and producing homogeneous products, but they produce rather similar products. And we had a similar situation in the UK. You had two satellite broadcasting services, British Sky or British Broadcasting System and Sky, and so on. We will get the specific example later. The point is you have two firms entering the market, and if you have two firms being in the market selling a homogeneous product and having both marginal cost, constant marginal cost of C, the result will be one of Bertrand competition. Okay, and suppose we have an infinite horizon game, a dynamic game, then the point is if both firms are active, it's rather clear that price will be equal to marginal cost, and both firms will be make losses, and the losses are just equal to the F, the fixed cost. You might think, why are these firms so stupid to enter a market where we know they lose? Yeah, the point is, if both enter at the same time, the hope is that the other firm, the rival, exits at some time, and then from then on you earn the monopoly profit. And the interesting thing is here, and the interesting equilibrium is one in so-called mixed strategies. You stay in a market with a certain probability to exit X, okay? And this probability is chosen in a way that the firms are indifferent between staying in a market and exiting. So just to make this clear to you, first of all, I need some notation. R is the interest rate, pi m is the monopoly profit. So the per period profit would be pi m minus f. And what you get here is just the discounted profit once you start very soon with the monopoly profit stream. Now, firm 1 is indifferent between exit and stay if both firms are active. Yeah, what is a profit of firm 1? I put it differently here. What is a profit of firm 1 if both are active? Naja, the profit is in this period is just F, or actually minus F, of course, because price is equal to marginal cost, P is equal to C, and therefore profit is equal to minus F. So the losses are the fixed cost. Now, the point is, here we are talking about firm 1, okay? X2 is the probability that firm 2 exits in the next instant, in a sense, or in the next period. Then, if firm 2 exits, its profit from next period on will be just a monopoly profit for all time, and the monopoly profit is just the operating profit would be pi m minus f. So this is a net profit, then divided by R. This is just our infinite sum here, sum I from yeah, it's not really 0 to infinity, but here pi m minus f divided by 1 plus R over I, something like that, or yeah. And that's what it is. And you get then this thing here. Now, the point is, yeah, and what is your profit if the other one doesn't enter? So with what I could add with probability 1 minus x2, of course, 1 minus x2, the other one is still in a market, you're in a market, and therefore the profit is, okay, it would be, no, perhaps I don't know, I shouldn't do that, because it holds only if really it would be 0, okay? Because then you might enter exit as well, so I don't want to go to the details here, because actually it only works if it's a game in continuous time, and then we jump back to the f in the beginning. Okay, now the point is here. Oops. The point is here. You only stay in a market, you are indifferent between exiting and staying in a market if this is 0, okay? Of course, if it's greater than 0, you certainly stay, but you are indifferent between exiting and staying if that is 0. The point is, if, and that's the other equilibrium we will look into right now, if it's clear that you always stay, firm 2 will always exit. So, but we want to have an equilibrium in which both stay in a market. Okay, and if x2 is such that this is 0, you stay in a market. And the point is, from the viewpoint of firm 2, if x1 is this equal to this value, firm 2 will stay in a market. Okay, and both firms stay in a market, and both firms make losses. Why? Because they have the chance to make to get the monopoly position from the next period on. Okay, and what you see is, here's the probability you need to have. And this probability should be rather clear-cut. This is the exit probability, okay? Hopefully that's, I stated that here. Xi is a probability to exit. And it is more likely that you exit if F, the fixed costs are higher. That should be clear. You have higher per period losses. And if R is higher, so R means higher interest rate, the future is discounted more heavily. The future doesn't matter so much. The presence is important. Of course, and this exit probability goes down if your profit, if your expected monopoly profit goes up. Okay? So the profits are ex ante 0, but ex post you might earn the monopoly profit. And now here it gets confusing. What I do now is actually this is really a shortcut, because this game has to be put in continuous time. It gets then rather complicated. We might get to that, or we get to that when we discuss assignment 3 briefly, because it makes sense then to assume a Poisson process, which I might explain in more detail in a tutorial class. Poisson process meaning a process like you have with the light bulbs. It has no memory. If the light bulbs works, its hazard rate, that is the probability that it breaks down within the next few seconds, stays always constant, and you get the so-called survival function. And the underlying distribution function, cumulative distribution function, is the exponential distribution. But that's really an advanced topic. Okay. This is equilibrium 1. Equilibrium 2 is one, if you know, as we had once in Germany, Arena and Sky, two firms. At that time, Sky was called Premiere. At that time, we had two firms trying to set up a pay TV channel. It turns out, if you know as Arena that Sky will certainly stay in a market, you will exit immediately. Okay, but the point is what Tirol shows, for instance, is with sufficient uncertainty. If you are uncertain about your rival's fixed cost, you don't exactly whether they are high or low. Equilibrium 1 is a unique equilibrium. Okay, we will get back to that. I don't know. Hopefully, you got the point here. How does that really look like, this situation? I just want to draw it here. If you have time here, oops, it's hard to write it here. And if you have price here, if you have marginal cost here, how does your call this T star, how does your price path look like? You have a war of attrition until the point where one of the firm exits, and from there on you have a monopoly price. So what you have is you have a period of intense competition, a price war, then prices are driven to marginal cost. You have inefficient duplication of facilities, so you have two networks. Actually, there was some day where you had two, I think it was Iridium, two providers of satellites. So you had two sets of satellites in the sky, trying to or providing the same service. Okay, that seems like a duplication or like a waste of investment. And here, at some point, a monopoly emerges. Götz calls it naturally, which charges and textbook prices, since it is not possible, and no, we will not have any further entry the price when faced with this threat of a price war. Okay, but here you have the monopoly profit at some time, so that's what we are still waiting for. Sky seems not to earn monopoly profits. I don't know whether they are profitable at all. But the point is here, this is only ex post, ex ante. They already sunk a lot of money. And why is that so important? Because we observe this kind of price war frequently in the early history of a number of industries like railways. There were always fights of railways. You had even electric power distribution companies. So railroads were private at some time. There's a Hamburger Bahnhof and so on in Berlin. There at some time in the late 19th century, railroads were private. We had urban transit lines and we had competing cable or sky companies here. In the notes I have Arena and Premiere, and I have British Satellite TV. There was a war of attrition between BSB, British Satellite Broadcasting, and Sky Television. If you want to know more about it, it's written down in a game by Pankaj Gemawat, Games Businesses Play. Okay, you also have another case recently 5 or 6 years ago, digital satellite radio, where you had two competing companies in the US, which in the end merged because both of them made losses for a long time. And then you really have, like in this picture, you have a merger to monopoly. Okay, but the point is, either you allow these companies to merge and at least guarantee that some assets are used further on, or you will have just the exit of one firm, because that's not price equal marginal cost. If you have fixed cost, is not a sustainable equilibrium configuration. Okay. Another point which Posner mentions here, and to which we will get back in the next chapter, is a rent-seeking behavior. So monopolies invest really a lot. That's like with the British Satellite Broadcasting. They invest a lot, or not monopolies. So firms invest a lot to gain a monopoly, because monopolies are valuable to their owners because they produce monopoly profits, and this creates incentives for firm to spend money to attain or to win this monopoly position. And in the extreme, you have a dissipation of all monopoly rents. Again, we will get back to that. So you have to pay so much, and that's actually what happens here. You have to pay so much in the first period that you only can cover your losses you previously had, and this is what is dissipation of rents here. And in a sense, you might end up in a worst of all worlds from a welfare perspective, where you end up with a monopoly, and at the same time, all rents are wasted through wasteful expenditure, okay? And consumer end up paying the monopoly price. The war of attrition is not the worst of all worlds, because at least for some time you had the low prices, but there are other instances. Okay, now this is pretty much what I wanted to tell you in this chapter on contestable markets. Here we do some stuff related to that in IO course, in an industrial organization course, where we will also discuss entry deterrence, commitments, and so on, the Bain taxonomy of blockaded and Joe Bain's taxonomy of blockaded, deterred, and accommodated entry. I refer to the IO course here, and I move on to chapter 5. However, I want to make a short break here and ask for if there are any questions or if anything is unclear. Hopefully, mostly it's clear, but move on to WebEx shortly and make a short feedback break if I manage to do that here. Okay, turning to chapter 5, why regulate natural monopolies? The question here is, why should we regulate? And the standard answer is, of course, because there is a market failure. We will discuss in much more detail in this chapter how that looks like, that potential failure, what we should aim for when we regulate, and what we can achieve if we regulate. Unfortunately, regulation hardly ever is perfect. And then the question, of course, is how can we regulate? Here, I just want to provide you a very general overview. This overview is based on Josco's handbook article on chapter 3. You really should read it. This is a really interesting chapter. In a former lecture, I asked students to just read a chapter and didn't prepare any lectures. Actually, it was the very first time I gave the course, and I wanted to discuss it to them. Actually, no one had read it, so I had to tell the contents anyway on my own. That's why at some point I started to really just provide or prepare these kind of notes and slides. Okay, moving back here, just a reminder, we had this natural monopoly definition, which was a purely technological one. So this is just reproduces a previous slide. Sub-additivity was our definition of monopoly, and this not yet does allow you any conclusions whether we will really have a single firm being active in the market. Now, the starting point here, the usual case for regulation is that we have a market failure. This is a standard normative case. I tell my students already in Econ 101 in my Micro 1 class, namely that we have a cost in market failures, industries with natural monopoly characteristics, and probably I should add here where sunk costs matter, so that we don't have any contestability and so on. They typically exhibit poor economic performance in the sense that prices are not equal to marginal cost, and therefore we get social costs like a deadweight loss, or also redistribution from consumer surplus to producer profit. And the idea is here, or the hope is, that we can reduce that by implementing appropriate government regulatory mechanisms where we regulate prices, where we might also regulate entry, think of the far distance buses, and some additional maybe quality regulations, and might be able to improve the situation compared to an unregulated market allocation. Here, this is a slightly changed diagram compared to the slide deck I distributed. This is really the standard economic efficiency case, a regulated monopoly. This is a very positive view of regulation. First of all, here we assume that this is the price, this is a marginal cost, okay, MC. Then we would have AC here, standard downward sloping, so we have sub-additivity. Here we have our demand curve. Of course, first best you would know QFB is somewhere here. And of course, QFB is hard if you don't have lump sum transfers available and you cannot subsidize. So you typically might end up with QSB, the second best quantity. Of course, we could also write down here the first best price equal to marginal cost, and the second best price equal to average cost being here. Okay. That's price equal average cost at a point where the average cost curve intersects the demand curve. And now the interesting or good thing is, if we are a perfect regulator, benevolent and well informed about everything, we only need to guarantee a break-even constraint because lump sum subsidies are not available. We only end up with a very, very small kind of deadweight loss here. This would be our small deadweight loss. Okay. This is a rather optimistic picture of the regulator's activities and abilities, and we will get back to that in almost every chapter of the remainder. After, say, chapter 7, we will see that there are asymmetric information and so on. But for the moment, just assume as we have it, okay, or that it is like this, and that's the picture which is often compared to unregulated monopoly. So this is just what I just told you. The regulated private firm must break even. You would only provide the product if it can break even, and sub-additivity requires pricing above marginal cost. And a point here is that, of course, long-term credibility of regulator. There are a hold-up problem with sunk cost. If you're a European telecom telecom company, and you make sure that your users, your customers can make also phones abroad, it might be the case that the European Commission comes and says, oh, you are charging much too high price. Why shouldn't you just charge a price equal marginal cost? And then you are sitting on your sunk investment. Okay, so credibility, we will discuss that later on. But the point is here, Demsets would have called this more like a nirvana approach. We will get back to that as well. So here, no problems, we can do everything. And this nirvana approach holds just, or in particular, if we compare this rosy picture of regulation with the very bad picture of an unregulated monopoly, which Josko points draws here. But here, this is might also be very realistic if we have an unregulated, completely unregulated entrenched monopoly with high entry barriers and so on. But I just want to move on here. You see the standard problem with an unregulated monopoly, first of all, is here were our previous marginal cost C, called the efficient marginal cost. So this was our previous C. And what you see is here, this line would be your marginal revenue, okay? And here, these are our efficient marginal cost, this would be the monopoly price. Of course, this monopoly price is much higher than the price we previously had here, when we had price equal average cost, and we get an additional deadweight loss. But I have to erase it again because unfortunately the world really is worse if we have an unregulated monopoly. First of all, what might happen is that production or monopolies are not well known for being very efficient, even private ones. And the point is here, what Sir John Hicks, Nobel laureate, said is that the best of all monopoly profits is acquired life. You don't have to work hard, and therefore you don't have an incentive to really minimize your cost. And that's why you might produce at higher than the efficient cost. You might produce at CX inefficiency. This is a term coined by Harvey Leibenstein in the 60s, I think, or 50s, X efficiency or X inefficiency. So the point is, you produce at higher cost, but if you produce at higher cost, you will get, of course, if these are your marginal cost, you will get this even higher price here, and this will be your monopoly price, in a sense, based on this X inefficiency. Okay, and first of all, or second, of course, this would then be here the monopoly profit. Okay, this rectangle. And what I told you just a minute ago was this rent-seeking argument. you might also waste some money, and I have to raise it again, you might also waste some money in order, or have to do some lobbying expenditures in order to guarantee that you keep your monopoly. I don't want to mention here Deutsche Bahn and lobbying that no far distance buses are allowed and so on. But you always have a lot of lobbying with all these companies here. And lobbying might also use or lead to waste of some kind of expenditure. So, and here it's on the next slide here, I just have this area X. The red area X is just this waste due to inefficient production, and R is this waste in terms of the rent-seeking expenditures. So what you see here compared to our nice regulated world, where you have this very small red triangle here as a deadweight loss, and even this is really a strong assumption, and you guarantee production at efficient cost. Here you would have much more deadweight loss, because all these range here you would have all these range here would be further deadweight loss, okay, because you have higher cost than necessary and so on. So you have really an extreme kind of deadweight loss. Okay, hopefully it's above here, because this would be cost, but anyway, okay. But this huge triangle here is your loss. Okay, so here you see you really get an argument for why you should regulate, because you have a lot of inefficiency. However, of course, we will, in particular in terms of X inefficiency, whether the regulator really manages to ensure that the regulated company produces efficiently at lowest possible cost, that will be a topic we deal with in the remainder of the course at really large length. Okay. Yeah, here just what I already showed to you. We have inefficient price signals. Prices are higher than marginal cost. Here is just the rearrangement of the Amoroso-Robinson relation, and the Lerner index. What you see here, if demand is very elastic, we get hardly a problem, because the Lerner index will be very low. In perfect competition, epsilon would be infinite, so price would be equal marginal cost. So the higher the elasticity is, the lower is the Lerner index, and the lower is the distortion. Another problem is that we also have hardly a distortion, and I always try to draw these very strange things here. If demand is very inelastic, so very steep here, and you have some marginal cost here, and you would have then some this would be first best, and you see here if you have some marginal revenue here, this is rather small here. Okay, this triangle, and it gets the smaller the steeper demand the demand curve is. But the point is, so you only have a small distortion in efficiency terms. That is, the output is very close to the efficient ones, but distribution matters. Okay, you get huge monopoly profits here, and this is and you get very small consumer surplus, and of course this is something regulators and politicians buffer as well. Okay, another point is that you have inefficient cost of production, so you might get these excess capacity. Okay, another point here, that firms, Alcoa is a case we probably tell it more detail in the industrial organization course. Alcoa, the aluminium company of America, built up huge excess capacities in terms of production in order to prevent entry. There was a famous antitrust case in the 50s or 40s. And lobbying, I told you already, this Posen argument. And this would be the area R. You might get also inefficient entry under competition. And in an unregulated situation, I mentioned the war of attrition. If we don't have a sustainable if we don't have a sustainable competition of contestable market, and we get duplication of facilities. I managed X inefficiency, managerial slack, more unionization. Actually, that's what our regulated companies are well known for, or our state-owned or state-run companies. They typically have unionization which is at above 90%. And managerial slack, we will get back to that once we talk about moral hazard. Managers, knowing that they don't face the risk of bankruptcy or something like that, may not be forced to work hard. Okay, so the point here is a bit difficult for me to tell you that, because these are very often also inefficiencies we associate with regulated companies. Okay, I don't want to go detail here. Typically, the product quality choice of unregulated companies is not optimal, whether it's of regulated or of state-owned, state-run companies is the other questions. R&D expenditures might not be optimal, but I also do that in the other course. Okay, now we get to the questions. First of all, we saw that there are problems, there are welfare problems, okay? And we might be able to improve upon the unregulated outcome. We have to discuss how well we are going to do that, but at least the previous slides gave you some indication that we might be able to improve upon that, okay? The problem is, which sectors do we regulate? There are so many sectors which exhibit these kind of natural monopoly characteristics. I mentioned, I think, the weather app. Every weather app is a natural monopoly. And the question is, which industries are natural monopolies? Here you see the quotation marks, namely monopolies where you really typically should end up and do end up with a monopoly. And what are industries which are competitive even though it's imperfect? Just think of telecoms. This is my leading example. Is Deutsche Telekom still a monopolist in terms of, say, providing broadband internet? To a large degree, Deutsche Telekom is still regulated, even though it faces competition from cable TV, which is now all Vodafone, formerly Unity Media and Kabel Deutschland. It faces competition, okay? And cable TV, which was formerly a monopoly in large parts of the US, for instance, and also in Germany, it faces competition from satellite TV broadcasting. Okay, fixed line networks face competition from mobile telephony, and still fixed line networks are regulated. Okay, so this is an important question. Do closed substitutes exist? What is, in antitrust terms, we call it, what is the relevant market? And do we have to regulate a certain industry where not several or many firms are active, but only a few ones? Okay. And here, with respect to this relevant product market, or the question of which sectors to regulate, we have the so-called 3 criteria test in the EU, in particular with respect to the telecom sector. These 3 criteria test applies 3 criteria in order to determine whether a market is a candidate market for what is called ex-ante regulation. What does ex-ante regulation mean? Ex-ante regulation means that you have a regulatory authority who really has to approve the conditions and the terms for the regulated company, like the prices it is allowed to charge, like the access charges, and so on. And in the notes, you get this quote from ERG report here from BEREC. ERG is not independent regulators group, is a European regulators group. And the point is, what they say, need to regulate the sector if high and non-transitory barriers to entry exist. So you see, no, not contestable and so on. Still, if we have these right entry barriers, we might have a market structure which is somehow competitive. So we have to ensure that if you want to regulate, that the market structure does not tend towards effective competition within a relevant time horizon. So we have huge entry barriers in mobile telephony. You need to have spectrum and so on, but still we have 3 or 4 network providers. Is that sufficient for competition, or do we need to regulate that? And then even if we think it's not sufficient to have the 3 or 4, is competition law, and this means ex post regulation, is that adequate to address the market failures? Okay. Many interesting questions, really in a sense the key of the regulatory debate still in telecoms and other sectors, railways and so on. Another point which is not so clear is the geographic market. Is a certain harbor, a certain airport an essential facility, or does Frankfurt airport face enough competition from Amsterdam Schiphol, for instance, or because intercontinental or passengers who want to fly intercontinental have a good opportunity to move, to switch. Okay, that's another point here. Here we move on with this discussion. Do we have a natural monopoly? Do we have competitive industries? Here's this narrow monopolies or narrowly defined product or brand. So the point is always here, that's like the weather apps. We never would have the idea that we should regulate the entry in weather apps. So the question is always, can we improve on the situation by regulation? So what is a feasible alternative industry configuration if we would try to regulate? So is regulation better than imperfect competition? So the consequence is that the technical definition of the natural monopoly must be carefully separated from the questions of whether and how to regulate a particular industry. Okay, that's what we always do, and that's what I mentioned several times. Now, if we want to regulate, there are also other considerations which matter. I already mentioned income distribution. Okay, the point is that if we have an unregulated situation, remember, most of you didn't know probably the price of electricity, so we won't have a strong change in electricity consumption if electricity prices change in terms at least of the residential customers, but we would have strong distributional effects, and that's what we typically do not want. Another important discussion in terms of regulation is what we call universal service. And this relates to essential services. What does universal service mean? Yeah, until say 20 years ago, when we started with the liberalization of telecoms, we had universal service that every household should be or should have at reasonable rates, erschwingliche Preise in German, the possibility to have access to telephony. Okay, that would be affordable access. The question is, what kinds of services are essential? Now in our Corona times, you might think that gigabit broadband interconnection is an essential service, and that companies should provide this service. Okay, how much is essential? Is it a gigabit? Is it just for a megabit, and so on? Okay. And why is broadband internet essential, but food or toilet paper is not essential? Okay, is electricity? So these are complicated questions which typically have been decided on political terms, but this is really part of an ongoing discussion. And what we also have here, and I mentioned that briefly already in the context of cross-subsidization, we subsidize different geographic area. We have the same prices for electricity, both in Bavaria than in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, even though we have much wind in the north and no wind in the south and no good connection, no good transmission lines here. But Bavarians, politicians want to prevent that Bavarians pay higher prices. Taxation by regulation, finally, until some 10 or 20 years ago, municipalities like the city of Gießen used their electricity division of the Stadtwerke, of the municipal company, to cross-subsidize like the public transport or public swimming pools and so on. So you had excessive prices for some customers or for some consumers, mostly for all in terms of electricity, to subsidize another group, that is the ones who use public transport with low prices. You had cross-subsidization. The problem is, and you will get back to that, with competition, if you allow for competition, it's typically no longer sustainable. And finally, one final point, this universal service currently in the European discussion is also put in terms of, I think it's the abbreviation is really SG, services of general economic interest is missing. In German, we would call it Daseinsvorsorge. Okay? So you see many different arguments why we should regulate or why we do regulate. And the unfortunate point is that often this is not well compatible with each other in a sense. Okay, move on. Yeah, this is just a reminder. I had that previously, that you had these problems once you allow for entry. There are other considerations. I don't want to go into detail here, like price discrimination. For price discrimination, I just want to refer you to the industrial organization course. But the point is here, regulation typically wants to prevent that we get price discrimination. Just an example here, Deutsche Bahnnetz, or DB Netz, the infrastructure manager of Deutsche Bahn, is not allowed to treat its sister companies like DB Regio, so the local public transport company, or the regional public transport company, or the far distance passenger train company, DB Fernverkehr, different from other companies also like DB Freight. Okay, and you typically have legal and policy constraints on the nature of the price structures that regulatory agencies have at their disposal. I mentioned already same prices for electricity in Bavaria than in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, even though the different kind of production would costs here would require, and transmission costs would require, or would say at least justify different prices. Okay, this is a terrible slide as you see it. It has too much text. Read Josko's section here on political economy considerations. I really took it from here. This is really interesting and important stuff he puts up here. What is this political economy story about? It's about that regulation, as you see it, and if you observe it, very often is not due to just something like welfare maximization. It's a result of interest groups. Okay? Why do we not have Uber? Because we have a strong taxi lobby. Okay? Which tries to prevent entry, which tries to guarantee their rents and so on. Okay, the point is here, and that's what Posner and Stiegler and others and Demsetz already showed in the early or late 60s, early 70s, is that actual regulation is often not the result of a public interest goal of mitigating the distortions, but the effect of lobbying. Okay, of consumers, of suppliers, of environmental or other groups, like what we had in terms of roaming regulation, that you can make calls abroad as cheap as you can do them at home. This is just part of the consumers and of politicians who want to, in particular EU politicians who want to get liked by their constituencies. Okay, and the point is that these lobbying, this interest, has an important effect on whether there is regulation, where regulation is, how this regulation looks like, and so on, how regulatory mechanisms are changed, etc., etc. And the important point here is this Posner quote here. For many years, students were taught that regulation had been introduced to respond to natural monopoly problems, a public interest view of price, entry, and regulation. And actually, they haven't looked into this public interest group. This would be like the public interest theory or the positive theory of regulation. Okay, and what this does, it confuses the normative market failure case for regulation with the positive question. So the question, what is the fact? Why has this price and entry regulation really been introduced? Okay, and the point is here, because we observe some regulation, think of Uber, of the taxis, it's not necessarily, or think also of the far distance buses, that it's due to a natural monopoly that we should have only this, but for some other reasons. Okay, it often reflects political considerations, certain regulations. And that's what you always have to keep in mind. Always be skeptical. Okay, that's what economists typically are. They're skeptical and cynical. That's why they are not liked so much. But anyway, I think this is important to take that all into account. And it's even more important that you read chapter 3 of Josco. Okay, that's really an interesting chapter, which gives you a lot of background. Okay, the too much text on my slides here, because I was always afraid that you wouldn't read the Josco chapter, so I thought I put a lot of that from that chapter on my slides so that you read at least the slides. You have these political considerations with interest groups here. The point here is that very often you have regulatory agencies, and these regulatory agencies do not simply maximize social welfare, because they are typically not really, how independent they are is really the question. Josco states that no regulatory agency is completely independent of political influences. Think of the 5G spectrum auction in Germany, where the Bundesnetzagentur, the Federal Network Agency, had to implement some conditions, some coverage conditions, weiße Flecken, Funklöcher, okay, so white spots where we didn't have access, where you didn't have reception for your phone, and they had to provide some conditions into these spectrum auctions as well, even though, due to political pressure, even though it was clear that you can never, or companies can never provide these coverage with the 5G spectrum. They would have to use 4G spectrum, okay? Yeah, the point is here, so regulation or regulatory authorities are typically not really independent, and therefore, even though if a regulator does not maximize her own utility, still there are things which keep her from maximizing social welfare, in particular political influence. And the point is, and this is also an important point, that regulation leads to direct costs. So you have to pay regulators and many civil service people working there, but you also have indirect costs, okay? Costs for compliance with that, costs of insufficient investment incentives, and so on. And very often the direct costs are small compared to the indirect costs. We will get back to that. From the viewpoint of economists and of you as students and of me as a professor, these indirect costs are of course good, because that means these departments, these regulated companies, need many economic experts to provide all the discussion around these regulatory proceedings. And they also, once in a while, need a professor to write an expert report on that. Okay, now time is moving on here. If there are no questions on WebEx, I just move on. This is now what I'm doing is just telling you anecdotes here. This is the background, okay? We have several questions. If we regulate, the question is, what performance do emerge and how do we solve them, okay? The question of efficiency. That was pretty much, we want to get rid of the deadweight loss if we regulate. The question is, can we do that? Can we achieve that? Which kind of instruments are available to get good performance, to get good prices? And what are their strengths and weaknesses? What are the performance attributes of the industry configuration that would be expected to emerge in such a regulated environment? So what do we achieve? Okay, and the question is, taking into account what we could achieve if we regulate, is that better than on balance the imperfect market outcome? Okay, including or taking into account all the direct and indirect costs. So now I'm pretty quick moving through these remaining slides, because this is to a certain degree redundant, because we did that in chapter 2 and also just previously, and that's what you already have heard in your undergraduate studies. Economists are always focused on efficiency, and there are two different kinds of efficiency: allocative and productive efficiency here. There will be also distributive and dynamic efficiency, but to be distributive efficiency, we wouldn't call this, but distribution is another goal we have to call it. So the first allocative efficiency would be efficient pricing of goods and services. We discussed that at length, and second best and so on. Product efficiency, that was related to this X inefficiency I had. It's not simply means economies of scale and economies of scope or exploited, but here you somehow manage to as a regulator to solve the problem which arises because your incumbent must not or need not be afraid of a competitive entry. Therefore, it has insufficient incentives to minimize costs from both static and dynamic perspective. Okay, so here this would be this X inefficiency, and that's where regulators provide substitute incentive. It's called incentive regulation. We will get back to that in German. It's Anreizregulierung. You want, of course, also have efficient levels of output and investment. Just think in terms of broadband internet. You want to make sure that also that everyone gets a decent internet access, okay? And you want to certify that you get here the efficient levels of investment. You want to get the efficient levels of service quality and product variety. In Germany, if we talk of service quality of regulated utilities, typically Deutsche Bahn comes to mind, and its punctuality and so on. And product variety is, yeah, in terms of, think of just public broadcasting, the öffentlich-rechtliche. Do we need more, what is it, Herzblatt or Volksmusik or something like that? What is the right kind of product variety and quality? Of course, what you also want is you want to extend rent. Typically, what we often use is welfare or total surplus is just consumer surplus plus profit, or like producer surplus. Regulatory policies are typically not thinking that they assume some factor alpha, they give some weight to the profit, which is smaller than 1. It might even be 0. So regulatory policies do care for distribution. Okay, they are not agnostic about the distribution of surplus. They just don't say that, oh, doesn't matter if consumers pay a high prices, we know then we get higher profits. Okay. The other point is, of course, you cannot, even if you would have an alpha equal to 0, you don't care for the profits of the company. You have to care as a regulator, but because if a firm doesn't make profit, if a firm doesn't make a profit from providing some broadband internet service to a remote area, it just will not invest, okay? And that's then the worst of all worlds for consumers, because if the firm does not invest, the price is actually infinity, which is much higher than a monopoly price. Okay, that's the social welfare function with consumer surplus. And yeah, I already told you here these other regulatory goals here from the viewpoint of economic efficiency. Here we have the distributional goal, like universal service goal. Here, of course, this is not directly an economic efficiency argument, but it's an argument that we want to achieve these goals efficiently at minimum cost, okay? If we want to provide broadband internet to, say, everyone, we want to do it in an efficient way. So, and the efficient way might not be to provide it via, say, fiber optical cable, but via 5G. It might be cheaper to connect some remote household via 5G rather than, or via satellite rather than by fiber. Okay, this is then where economic efficiency matters also in terms of distribution. Ultimately, and this is a conclusion from Josco, sound policy, public policy must ask whether the potential improvements in performance relative to the unregulated outcomes are likely to be greater than the direct and indirect costs. Okay, so that's what I always keep telling you. Just don't think if something works not perfect, if it's unregulated, just don't think that you will be able to improve a lot on that if you introduce regulation. Just a final point in the notes, I have some further notes about the Bavarian broadband program, which is actually something which has these universal service goals and Daseinsvorsorge, and you see that in some parts these causes terribly high costs, up to say 25,000 euro per connected household, and then this household just makes phone calls and doesn't use the internet. Probably Corona, this is probably the only one positive thing one can say about this pandemic, it will lead to really a push in terms of digitalization. Okay, and that's interesting to look in particular how much we get in terms of e-government and so on. But wasting your time here, I have to move on. History. How did, after having looked into why we should regulate, okay, we would regulate because we have market failure, and we want then to ensure efficiency, and this means allocative efficiency, this means productive efficiency, this means also that our distributional goals are reached in an efficient way. Okay, we want now to look at how regulation evolved historically, and always take in mind that the regulation we actually saw is often the result not of this kind of maximization of social welfare, of this public interest goal of public welfare or of social welfare, this public interest goal, but the result of, say, lobbying of interest groups. Okay, yeah. In the US, how did regulation look like there? In the US always had private enterprises. Just think of AT&T, the American telecom and telephone and telegraph company. I think it was called at some time, and they always had in the US these kind of private enterprises. Still, for instance, freight railways, also private, power and gas companies, also private, and you always had then some regulator. And of course, if you have a regulator and a private company where you have stock owners with property rights, you always have a tension between the two. And in order to regulate that, you had so-called independent commissions on both the state and the federal levels. On the state levels, these were the Public Utilities Commission, or the PUCs, or the Public Service Commissions, the PSCs. You once in a while see that again. And there are also other utilities or regulatory commissions, and you have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the FCC, which would be the regulator Federal Communications Commission, which would be the regulator for telecoms and so on. In Europe, it was different because for a long time you had just state-owned and state-run enterprises, and only in the like Deutsche Bundespost, like Deutsche Bundesbahn, so it was always a bit different in terms of, say, electricity transmission lines, but these were mostly municipal, like RWE, RWE. This was really owned to a large degree by the various rural municipalities. Okay, and only in the 80s it started in the UK under Maggie Thatcher, who needed money at that time. She started to privatize British Telecom and then British Rail and so on, British Gas, and so she started this privatization, and of course then also liberalization of the respective market. This privatization just shouldn't mean that you just replace a public monopoly with a private one. So it was that if you privatize and it's no longer state-owned enterprise with, in a sense, own or club regulation, you need an independent regulatory authority who then supervises this private company. And you also had a liberalization, particularly in the telecoms market and to a lesser extent here. And here you really should read this paper by Cohn and Doyle. The point is, you're also young here. Many of the liberalizations took place in the late 90s, early 2000s. It still goes on in electricity. Here you just get an overview. Once you write a thesis or a seminar paper, here you get the important directives. You see that it's not so long that we started with liberalization. It's in 99, okay? And in gas, it only started in 2000, and I don't know from which time on you were free to choose your electricity if you were a residential customer. Postal services, probably even you still remember that Deutsche Post had a monopoly on letters. This is not long gone, and currently, but I don't even know that you know that they do not have a monopoly any longer. Okay, you might have you might receive an email once in a while from not an email, a letter transported or distributed, delivered by Mittelhessen Mail, or how it is called. Gas here, what was in a sense one of the most important liberalizations, and also in a sense most successful, was the liberalization and regulation of EU telecoms until 20 or 25 years ago, or actually until 30 years ago. Your handset would have to be one which was provided by Deutsche Bundespost, which was a Wählscheiben telephone. Okay, I yesterday looked up the pictures, and I don't know whether you know a Wählscheiben, a classic dial telephone. And you were not allowed to buy your equipment on your own. The important point is 1998, because there we had full liberalization of public telephony services and infrastructures. Everyone could provide telephone services, not only Deutsche Bundespost. At that time it was already split up in Deutsche Telekom and in Deutsche Post. And what you had is, because it was known that you had an infrastructure, Deutsche Telekom, which might have natural monopoly characteristics, so it was opened up and it was provided on open access connections, and it had to provide interconnection of voice telephony services and had to provide access to what is called public switched telecommunications network, their main switches. Okay, and they had to grant non-discriminatory, proportional, and transparent access. And so this is how one-and-one united internet and all your, I don't know whether you have some prepaid phone or still some call-by-call phone. This is how it works. Yeah, and here you see the national regulatory regimes. Important is in Germany, we have the antitrust authority, which is the Bundeskartellamt. Formerly we had the RECTP, Regulierungsbehörde für Telekom und Post, which is now the Bundesnetzagentur, Federal Network Agency. I often will mention Ofgem, Oftel, DTI, ORR, these are just the British regulators, which you get here in detail. I think I'm doing it even in time, even though I hurry through this. So this is just many of the things you just got. Is if you regularly read a newspaper, you will always notice that these regulators and these industries are mentioned. So the final point is here, we didn't discuss whether it's better to have public ownership and state-owned companies or regulation of privately run and privately owned monopoly companies and regulatory authorities. I cannot give you the answer. So what is the relative efficiency? That's actually the question of a public company, of a state-owned company compared to a private company. In the notes, I gave you a few references, like the survey paper from the Journal of Economic Literature by Megginson and Netter, and they come to the conclusion that research now supports the proposition that privately owned firms are more efficient and more profitable than otherwise comparable state-owned firms. There's limited empirical evidence and so on. And then there's another paper by Aitan Czesinski and Luis Lopez Calva, and they state that the evidence strongly supports the implication that the appropriate, if provided that the appropriate regulation is in place, efficiency can be achieved through infrastructure privatization. Okay, and there's an updated review of that. So, of course, that does not mean that private companies are always better. You always find anecdotes for the one and for the other, and nevertheless, but on average, just think of the discussion of Lufthansa. If the state then would buy an important share of them, of course you would get something like a soft budget constraint. You would get that trade unions prevent something like important changes in the number of the workforce and so on. Okay, so but that's something we will move on. There are other forms for solving the natural monopoly problem. In particular, franchise bidding, we will get back to that, and competition for the market rather than competition within the market is the important topic here. You have to wait until, say, chapter 10 or 11 when we discuss that. So I want to leave it at this here. Thank you for joining me for this discussion today, and I'm available now again on WebEx, and I say, if I manage to get the webcam here, I just want to say goodbye and thank you.